Hi everybody, my name's Karen Reissmann. I'm a health worker. I'm from Manchester, and a week and a half ago I organised a protest of 40 people, health workers, furious about the 1% pay offer that the government had given us, that we know will drive more and more health workers out of the health service and make healthcare even more difficult. And I was given a £10,000 fine for organising a protest that was a perfectly safe protest that had 40 people on, that wasn't about safety, but was about clamping down on protest. And if that was the only thing, then I think that's bad enough. But actually, I called the meeting together because that is just one example of what is a growing level of attack and intimidation of people who want to resist and want to change things that they believe are unjust about the society that we live in. We saw at the weekend, we saw women who were mourning the death of Sarah Everard, but also demanding the right to walk the streets without fear of violence, then attacked by the very people who not only employed the person who allegedly murdered Sarah Everard, but actually then came and attacked the women who were fighting for the right to walk the streets without male violence. And there is something disgraceful about the way that the police are increasingly behaving, and something disgraceful about the way that the governments are using more and more restrictive, repressive legislation and practice in order to attack what we're allowed and not allowed to do. And then on Monday, many people won't have heard of it until Monday, they brought in the police and crime and sentencing bill, which has draconian powers to limit if you're making too much noise and you upset somebody, if you one person on their own, right, demonstrating and protesting, can become somebody who can become a major criminal and arrested, and you can face up to 10 years in prison for these offences. And I just think, I called together the meeting because I just think we need to have a big response to this. We cannot allow this to go unchallenged. So it is crucial that we get as wide a layer of people today, and that's what I've attempted to start to do. I know there are other people who are organising things as well, and I think we need to look at how we can move forward to mobilise the biggest number of forces and to continue to resist. And we have to give all credit to the women over the weekend and over this last week, and the people who've joined them, right, who have said we're not putting up with this, who have faced and risked fines, further fines and arrests. And even when you get legal observers being sort of arrested and fined, you think there is something fundamentally wrong with the system and the way that we work. So I'm not going to talk for any longer because I think it's important that we hear the fantastic array of speakers that we have today. The first one is a woman from Manchester, where I live, Iris, who organised a vigil and a protest in Manchester after the death of Sarah Everard. So I have great pleasure in asking Iris to start us off, please.
Thank you. Last Saturday, I, like everyone else here, I'm sure, was deeply enraged by the murder of Sarah Everard, the scenes that we witnessed at Clapham Common and the violence used by police on women who were simply mourning the loss of one of our own. Here in Manchester, our own vigil was cancelled by the Greater Manchester Police and moved online. But after seeing the horrifying scenes emerging from London and the sheer anger I felt and those around me and online felt, I decided that we needed our voice to be heard in a more meaningful way than over a Zoom screen. At our vigil, we heard countless stories of women, both young and old, who had been abused not only by men, but by a system that is built to withstand the patriarchy and that does not protect us when we need it the most. It was both moving and heartbreaking and showed the collective trauma that we as women have faced far too long. It gave the women their voice and that they so desperately needed, and gave us a chance to heal from the events of the week. When something as tragic as the murder of Sarah Everard happens, we need to be able to come together as a community, not only to grieve and mourn, but to allow your anger to be voiced as a collective. The tragic event from last week has sparked anger across the country, as women have had to be reminded yet again that we are not safe, and that no matter what precautions you take, what clothes you wear, or what streets you walk, you are still in danger. It has also become the tipping point for many people who are fed up with the police attacking the citizens it claims to protect. We must remember that it has not even been a year since the large Black Lives Matter movement and the protests in June, which took place across the entire country, which also called for defunding and changing of our police force, and yet nothing has changed. For our Black women, our Muslim women, our trans women, our Roma and Traveller women, and so many more, the police represent a dangerous and powerful threat that is soon to gain even more ways to oppress us. In recent days, we have seen a mobilisation of thousands across this country who are angry at a proposed police crime sentencing and courts bill, which will bring in some of the most draconian laws this country has seen in decades. Our government has also been ignoring the women it claims to protect and has continued to ignore us even in this aftermath of this tragedy. While women across the country called for an end to police violence, it was announced that plainclothes officers with the power to rape and kill on duty will now be stationed in bars and clubs post-COVID, and we will not be able to peacefully protest these matters without being at risk of arrest or prison time. This is why now more than ever, we must come together and fight these bills and ensure that our right to safety and our right to protest is not taken away before our very eyes. It is vital for us to come together as a country and ensure that this bill does not go through. For if the tragedy that befell Sarah could happen today, who knows what we will be facing in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iris. That was an amazing sort of start. And I think that the courage of people who came out despite the threats that they'd seen the week before, I think has to be really commended. So amazing response. And thank you very much to everybody who came out last Saturday. Really, really impressive. Our next speaker is someone who is from the constituency that Sarah Everard was killed in. It includes where she lived. Belle Ribeiro-Addy has spoken out both in Parliament and on the protest that we've seen, and has been a consistent fighter for justice. And I have great pleasure in asking Belle to come and speak to us today.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to overtalk because I know that we've got so many great speakers who are probably going to touch on a number of the things that I am saying. But I think it's really important that we see where we're headed with this government. Now, historically, we were meant to have a tradition of policing by consent in this country, and it's very clear that the government want to end that. They want more armed police, more random stop and search. They're ploughing on with the failed prevent programme, and we've seen what they've done with a lot of the acts that they've managed to push through during this past year. Now, you would have thought that government in the situation that we are, which is a global pandemic where so many people are dying, where so many people are being left destitute, would be focused on the pandemic. But instead, we've had an overseas operations bill, we've had the Spycops bill, and now we're seeing this policing, crime, sentencing and courts bill. Now, all of these things all put together have been specifically designed to curtail our civil liberties. Now, the Tories like to make out that they're the party of free speech. They complain every single time that, somebody quite controversial is on their side is stopped from speaking on a university campus. But we can see that it's not about free speech for them. It's about silencing everybody else. They have attempted again and again to police our thoughts. So if anybody's going to say anything that is against them, they don't want to hear it. And they're essentially politicizing the police in that way. The police are meant to keep us safe, not police our views. Now, the idea that any government should be able to completely restrict what it is that the population thinks is something that we would call totalitarianism. But instead, they plow ahead with it, and they have used the coronavirus pandemic to their ends to do this. And we really do have to make sure that it stops. And it doesn't end with the policing, crime and sentencing and courts bill. We're seeing coming back next week the renewal of the Coronavirus Act. And I want to make everybody aware of that. The renewal of the Coronavirus Act is very, very key because, we have comrades on this call and people who have been protesting picket lines for example, the GMB fire and rehire protesters protesting about that have been fined under the Coronavirus Act because of these very restrictive things they've put in place. Now, this comes back next week, Thursday, and I know other speakers are going to speak specifically about the police and crime sentencing and courts bill. So I want to make it very, very clear to you all that when this comes back, we need to be lobbying as many people as we can to vote it down. Now, there are key measures in that bill, yes, that have allowed us to do certain things, such as have people come back from retirement to work in the NHS, and the government claim that furlough is something that's gone underneath this bill. And I think those things definitely important. However, if we vote this bill down, we are given 21 days for the government to come back with another bill. And when they come back with that other bill, I think it's very, very important that then we have a chance as members of parliament to actually interact based on the views that our constituents have put forward, and put forward a bill that protects our civil liberties, that actually puts things in place to protect renters through this crisis, that protects workers through this crisis. At the moment, the Coronavirus Act is all about consolidating more and more power for the government, and a government that has presided over the deaths of 130,000 people, and unemployment and the worst economic recession that we have ever seen in this country should not be given any more power. And I look forward to standing with all of you to make sure that that doesn't happen. Thank you.
That's brilliant, Belle. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Belle. Really, really powerful speech. And you're absolutely right. It is more than just the police crime and sentencing bill. It is the whole ethos. You look at the horrific anti-trade union laws and anti-worker laws that exist in this country, but also the way that the bill that they're putting through is going to ramp up divisions and racism. It's going to encourage more stop and search, and the horrendous way that they look like they want to treat gypsies, travellers and Roma. And we have a speakers coming up on those issues later on. Our next speaker will be Tasha, who's from All Black Lives UK, who's one of the groups who's been mobilising on the recent protests with others, including Sisters Uncut. And they've been mobilising against racism, against police violence since last summer. And we know that the new law is going to give the police much, much more powers to disproportionately target black and brown people. And therefore, it's crucial that we unite together and that we stand up against the racism that is endemic through this government and through the bills that they're pushing through Parliament and through the practice of their actions, be it over COVID or anything else. So thank you very much, Tasha, for agreeing to speak today.
Thank you. So I think everybody is well aware of the kind of traction that Black Lives Matter got last year. And, we protested for 10 weeks straight. And I would say that every protest, even if we had, less than 100 people at the start, we'd have, 4 or 5 police vans, like riot vans, and things like that are used to obviously intimidate us and make us feel like we don't have the right to protest and we don't have the right to mobilise. And this is something that has been getting worse over the past year. So a couple of Black Lives Matter protesters who have been obviously protesting with Sisters Uncut and for women's rights have been told by the Met Police that they are being looked for by name, and if they are found, they will be fined. If they give a speech at a protest, they'll be fined £10,000. If they're caught by the police in London, they possibly could be arrested. Now, I haven't protested since last year, but that means if I would like to go and join in solidarity in London, I am at chance of getting arrested, even though I haven't actively protested or mobilised any protests within the last, 6 months. So I think things like that are really scary, and people need to kind of understand the severity of these issues. And it's definitely more than just about COVID now. People are saying, the fines are because of COVID regulations, but you can protest within COVID regulation and you still shouldn't get fined for that. Like Karen has said, she got fined for a COVID safe protest. And I think especially a lot of young people are starting to see that our rights are slowly being taken away by the older generation or the Tory government. Students have been completely neglected throughout this whole COVID situation. My university didn't reach out to me until, I had been at the protests for Black Lives Matter. So it's a completely institutional thing that is now affecting all of us. And I think that we all must mobilise together, all the different, not just minority groups, but a lot of people who have been ignored in this country. So it's the working class, it's women, it's gay people, it's trans people, it's Black people, it's Asian, other ethnic minorities. And it's definitely a great way for this country to move forward, because this is something that we can fight. And this is something that if we get enough people together and enough people, you know, mobilize and fight and believe that, you know, there's power in numbers and there's power in the people. And we must remember that this government is supposed to work for us, not against us. And I think a lot of us are feeling like the government are working against us. So what the thing is that we have to do is we have to come to panels like this. We have to come to meetings like this. We have to talk about what is going to be the best way to mobilize and stabilize, because this country is going in a very scary direction. People talk about, you know, we beat the fascists in World War II, we beat the Nazis. Okay, so if you can understand that, can you not understand the way that this country is going in at the moment? It's parallel, it's mirrored, it's very, very scarily close to a lot of things that we've seen in history. And if we don't tackle it now, it's going to be a complete repeating cycle. And I think a lot of young people are kind of coming to the end of it now and thinking, right, we have to do something. So I'm very happy to be on this panel with all these amazing people, and they'll highlight, you know, so many people. But yeah, thank you.
That's brilliant, Tasha, brilliant, thank you. And we've got over 900 people now watching, so I'd encourage people to try and build that up even more, and maybe ask people to come and share the Facebook pages and the Twitter, so that we can get more people coming in and watching. But that was really, really clear and very much heartfelt. So thank you, Tasha, for that. Our next speaker is Michael Mansfield. He'll be known to a lot of people because he's been active for a long time as a barrister campaigning on human rights. He's represented from cases as long ago as Stephen Lawrence and the victims of Bloody Sunday and the Hillsborough Justice campaign, and he's currently representing the family of Mohammed Hassan, who's the man who died after being in police custody in Cardiff. So as one of the sort of foremost sort of legal principled barristers that we know in the UK today, I have great pleasure in asking Michael to come and address us.
Thank you very much indeed. I welcome this opportunity to speak to everybody. I'm sorry to have to precede what I say with just a little correction, a misunderstanding, I think. Although I do represent Mahmoud Hassan, and I'm very pleased to do that in South Wales at an inquest hearing that will maybe later this year or beginning of next, I'm not here tonight to speak about his case. I wouldn't be allowed to anyway. And I'm not here representing the campaign either. I don't intend to cover those topics. I'm sorry to have to say that, but it's been broadcast in South Wales in that fashion, and I don't want the family to be upset in any way at all about that. So having said that, I just want to read something. Don't worry, I've got an eye on the time. It's very short. It's a report. Hundreds were arrested. Some were released. Most were detained, charged, imprisoned with offences of contempt, resistance to arrest, conspiracy to gather or assemble, and causing damage to property. Now, you probably guessed, that's an Amnesty International report. And it's not written about the United Kingdom, although looking at what's happening at the moment and the issues that have already been raised about where is this government going, where are we heading, and the last speaker equally, you will see that those remarks written about the Brazil situation a few years ago, Bolsonaro, and the oppression that has been happening there. But then you just glance, this isn't a matter of history and lessons being learned from history. That's bad enough. But actually, you've only got to look at contemporary global incidents. Beyond Brazil, Myanmar, thousands, and some ending up dead. Hong Kong, Russia, with the opposition leader returning to be imprisoned, thousands on the streets again, risking, in each case, their own lives and certainly their own well-being, for one simple reason, that they want accountability and they want to be able to challenge the established order where there are injustices, major injustices. Now, if we're not very careful, we probably have arrived already at this spot. The reason I don't want to, as it were, over-egg the pudding, but I do want to draw attention to the fact that these situations are arising now. The legislation, the policing bill going through at the moment isn't new. it's building on the Public Order Act in 1986, which came out with very similar provisions, only they didn't go quite far enough. Now we're right down to, well, it's the noise level and disturbance, and even if just one person, this is the gravamen of it all. They're really wanting to quell opposition, to quell and challenge anyone who is speaking out against policies that they uphold. And I'm going to spread this beyond the policing bill. What I want to illustrate, of course, with the bill is we've got thousands of people who have been arrested in relation to Black Lives Matter. But of course, the obvious one is Extinction Rebellion. I gather there are something like 3,000 cases going through the courts at this minute, which obviously we say should not be going through the courts at all. So this, I'm leaving aside COVID altogether for the moment. It's a complicating factor. But because what we have to deal with is a very different political thrust. And that political thrust has already been shown to be spreading into other areas. But the other areas besides policing itself, and I think it's, I'm sorry to have to say this in a way, shameful that the Labour Party were considering abstaining. They did that over the undercover policing bill. We need an effective opposition. And the irony is that they appear to have only changed their position because of a demonstration and how it was handled. Well, I'm sorry, it shouldn't take that to bring about that sort of change. I hope from now on they will be more rigorous in the way they oppose and more rigorous in the way they make clear what the momentum is at the moment and the direction in which we're heading. Because we have a government, and again, I think I don't need to spell it out too clearly, but I want to go back for a second because Boris Johnson really has a demonic majority. And as a previous, amazingly, Lord Chancellor said, Hailsham said many years ago, we have an elected dictatorship, essentially. That's what he was saying. And that's what we've got now. And we have to be extremely careful because of the way in which he's manipulating the situation. And just to step back for a moment, you will remember when he was challenged over Article 50, when he was challenged over proroguing Parliament. In other words, he wants to govern in the way that Henry VIII and others have done, without actually having Parliament at all. He loves it at the moment, of course, because there's hardly anybody there. And therefore, that momentum, when he came to power, has been continued. Now, something happened today, which you may not have noticed. There's no reason you would. The announcement was at lunchtime, but oh, stop, my God, okay. Just give me a second. I trust that people forgive me. They're trying to stop judicial review altogether if it's going to be dealing with policy. They announced it today. There's going to be something called the ouster clause, so that legislation will say you can't challenge this. That is extremely important because of what happened last Friday where a judge refused to get involved. So it's not just judicial review. They want to change the Supreme Court. Why? Because Lady Hale with a badge that shone, brilliant justice, actually put him down. And, oh, I'm not in the mood for recrimination, but that's what he wants to do. And so they're going to change the Supreme Court. And they also this year, please be aware, they want to revise the Human Rights Act. And I've got to stop at that point, even though I've got another 6 pages.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think you've got another 6 pages because the governments have got another 106 pages and more of legislation that they want in order to try and make it harder for us. And that's why you've got more and more. And that's the horrible thing that is about the society that we live in at the moment. But you're absolutely right that when people went out on the streets this week, it not only made the Labour Party change their mind, but to be honest, they've now said that it is going to be possible to legally protest after the 29th of March, which wasn't their view beforehand. And it does show when you go out on the streets and mobilise people, actually you can make a change to the society that we live in. And I think that's a really important lesson that you make. But thank you very much. And at some point we will have to do something that goes into a lot more depth because the government are in a lot more depth, but we're trying to just get us all a feel of what's going on at the moment. But thank you very much for coming today. Our next speaker is someone, again, I think will be known to lots of you. We've now got apparently over 1,000 people watching. So carry on sharing. It'd be fantastic to see more of you. But our next speaker is going to be Grace Blakeley, and Grace is an author and a journalist. She works with Nevera Media and Tribune magazine, and she's done some fantastic pieces, both sort of auditory and written, sort of recently. And so thank you very much for agreeing to come today, Grace.
Thanks so much, Karen, for organising this event, and thanks to all the speakers so far who've spoken very, very eloquently about how, what a massive transition this is in terms of the Conservative Party breaking with many years of alleged liberalism towards this kind of very profound authoritarian turn that we're seeing at the moment. And I want to think a little bit about why that's happening. The right have spent such a long time now bemoaning the apparent lack of freedom of speech, basically because a couple of Spectator columnists got uninvited from speaking at university meetings. And quelle surprise, the free speech warriors are completely and utterly silent about probably one of the biggest threats to our freedom of speech and expression that we've seen in decades. They care so much about Toby Young not being invited to speak Oxford, and they're completely silent about the fact that the right to protest and the right to express ourselves is being taken away by the state, by a government that just doesn't want to see any protest whatsoever. People can now, the police can now stop a protest if people are distressed by it. If one person says, I am distressed by this protest, and they call us snowflakes. This is government by snowflakes. They want to be completely and utterly immune from any form of criticism or accountability. This is fundamentally about protecting the government from any accountability as they shamelessly abuse their power. It's not a policing bill, it's a silencing bill. They're aiming at silencing the majority of the population who actually oppose them. They've used this crisis basically to dish out billions of pounds of public money to their friends, whether it's, Matt Hancock's neighbour or Serco or some of the biggest businesses in the country. This crisis has been used. The primary aim has been to support the interests of capital, of big business and big finance. And everyone else has been an afterthought and continues to be an afterthought, whether that's the people who are expected to survive on incredibly low levels of statutory sick pay, people who've become unemployed, whether it's, disabled people who have been severely affected by this pandemic. The Conservative Party has used its political power to channel money to those at the very, very top of society to protect their interests, just like they did in the financial crisis, and they're letting everyone else suffer as a result. At the same time as trying to distract everyone, trying to distract the media, trying to distract those who would protest with spectacle after spectacle, whether that's sending gunboats out to meet migrants crossing the channel or trying to protect the statue of Churchill. A sound government that is secure in itself would not be acting like this. It would not be implementing these incredibly authoritarian bills to silence the population. They know that the reason that they're trying to stop us from protesting is that they know that if we were able to be out on the streets, drawing attention to their outright corruption, people would take notice. That's been the feature of the pandemic. They've been able to get away with this because we haven't been able, largely, to get out onto the streets. They have no arguments, so they're resorting to force. If they really cared about justice, they would actually invest in access to justice. Let's bear in mind that this is taking place in the context of legal aid budgets being slashed. I was speaking to a legal aid lawyer the other day who's basically saying my profession is about to go extinct. They don't care about that. They don't care about declining rape convictions. They don't care about violence against women. They don't care about violence against migrants. They don't care about just complete and utter breaches of justice are inflicted upon those least able to resist. And that's why we have to be the ones that are resisting this. They know that when this pandemic ends, there is going to be a blossoming of anti-systemic movements all over the world, and they want to crush us before that happens. But they can't, because as Pablo Neruda famously said, you can cut all the flowers, but you can't stop spring from coming. Thanks so much, Karen, for organising this meeting, and solidarity to everyone on the call.
You're very, very welcome, Grace, and thank you very much for that. And that's a fantastic quote to end on, because that is so true. Our next speaker is someone who is she's Abiline McShane. She's a Gypsy Roma Traveller campaigner from the West Midlands, and she's somebody who is going to talk about some of the most horrendous, sharp end. To be honest, it's reminiscent of Nazi Germany, and I know people use that analogy quite a lot inappropriately, but I actually think when you look at what the sort of proposals that they have in these documents, they are really trying to threaten people, the whole of those communities' existence in Britain today. And I think that ramping up of racism, the legitimising of it in this bill, is absolutely disgraceful, and it comes on top of a long history of discrimination and repression. So thank you very much, for Abiline, for agreeing to come today. Really nice to have you.
Thank you for inviting me, Karen. My name is Abiline McShane, and everyone keeps saying I'm an activist. I'm not an activist, I'm just a mother. I'm a mother of a young girl who in 2012 had an accident. She fell 12 feet, fracture on the skull, bleed on the brain. So my first instinct was find a site, move on to the site while she was in the children's hospital. There was no site for me to go on, so I set up an unauthorised encampment with my mother and my other 2 children. Had I done that today, then what would have happened was my mother and I would have been put into jail. And when you see the word vehicle on the new bill, it doesn't just mean that that's your van or your car. That also means your home, your caravan. So you think that they're going to take our homes off us and they're going to take our vehicles off us. They're going to put us in jail. What's going to happen to our children? Our children are going to be put into care. So you think, well, maybe you should just move on to one of the local authority sites. There is no local authority sites up and down the country with any space for us to go on. One of the West Midlands cities has just built a transit camp that will take 6 caravans, and you're only allowed to stay on it for 4 weeks. Once you've stayed on it for your 4 weeks, you're not allowed to return to that city for 1 year. Could you imagine any other people being told you're not allowed to come to a city for a year? So you imagine if you've been to Manchester, you've been to Leeds, you've been to Birmingham, you've been to London, and you're told you're not allowed to go in any of those cities. You're moved out of them within 2 hours, or you're put in prison. Where are we supposed to go? The caravans don't float in the sea. So we're being told we're not allowed to do this, and the new bill says what the consequences will be, but there's nothing to say what we should do. So before, what I was fighting for was medical attention. My daughter had an accident in 2012, got her follow-up appointment in 2017. So I was fighting for medical attention for our children. I was fighting for education for our children. But now I'm fighting just to keep my home. I'm fighting so there's somewhere for us to go. Priti Patel is quick to tell us where we can't go. And most of the police and crime commissioners were against being given more legislation because they said that they didn't need any more rights to move us on and things like that, because it's not their responsibility. The duty of care to us is the same as for everyone else. The local authorities need to build sites, or they need to do negotiated stopping. You've already took away my culture by not allowing us the right to roam, which we have been in this country since the 14th century. We're the original migrants in this country. We're just asking, whenever you have your protests, whatever, please just remember the Gypsy Roma Traveller children up and down this country who are just about to be put into care because their parents will be put in jail because there's nowhere for them to go. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Abiline. And I just can't believe that they are not only failing to provide the sites and the places for you to go and driving you away from everywhere, but they're converting trespass from a civil offence to a criminal offence and turning people into criminals for a life that they live. And there is just something horrendous about that. So thank you very, very much indeed for speaking to us today. Our next speaker is Dave Smith. He's a union activist who was blacklisted, and he's part of the Spycops campaign, who've campaigned against police spies who've infiltrated movements and groups that we know only too much about now, but didn't at the time. So thank you very much, Dave, for agreeing to come and speak today about that, because I think that sort of the idea in this bill is that somehow the police are our saviours, that when we're fighting against injustice, it's the police who are actually campaigning against that injustice. So thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you very much, Karen, and it's an honour to speak at a meeting with such great speakers and activists. I'm speaking as an ex-construction worker, but I'm also speaking as a core participant in the public inquiry that's going on at the moment into undercover policing. My background is I was a building worker. When I was a building worker, I was elected as a union safety rep and campaigned about health and safety, whether it be asbestos or overflowing toilets or workers who died on building sites, even unpaid wages. And while we were doing that, while we were running campaigns over unpaid wages and running campaigns over health and safety, what happened was undercover police was sent in to infiltrate my trade union. Undercover police were sent in to infiltrate the safety campaigns that we were running. They didn't just infiltrate these campaigns. In some cases, they actually chaired the campaigns that we were running. One of the undercover police officers, I remember his name, when I knew him, his name was Mark Cassidy. He was a carpenter. His real name, we found out many years later, was Mark Jenner, and he was undercover police officer. And his union fees were paid by a bank account set up by Special Branch. I went to meetings with that man. I went to picket lines with that man. I went to protests and conference with him. And the police didn't just spy on us. The intelligence that they gathered, they gave to an illegal blacklist run by multinational construction companies that basically meant that building workers, not just me, but 3,200 building workers were on this illegal blacklist. And every time you tried to get a job, the big multinationals would check to see if your name was on this list. And if you was on the list, you'd be sacked or you wouldn't get a job in the first place. We suffered unemployment, family breakdowns, people lost their houses because of this, and in some cases, construction workers tragically committed suicide. For the women activists that these undercover police spied on, in some cases had long-term sexual relationships with these police officers. We've been let down by the system, the British legal system, which is institutionally racist, institutionally sexist. Not one of the police or the directors of these companies has faced a criminal trial. But if we now dare to protest, we've been forced to protest. We've been forced to blockade roads. We've been forced to occupy the head offices of construction companies. If we do that now, we could be sent to prison. The trade unions have had people sent to prison in the past. The Shrewsbury Pickets, Camel Laird, the Pentonville Five. And the only way we got those people any kind of justice wasn't to sit back and rely on lawyers or the police. It was to actually go out and protest from the bottom up. Give the police more authoritarian powers. That's the very last thing that we need. Solidarity to everybody in this meeting, whether you're fighting for union rights, for equality, for a better environment, against racism. When we come on our own, they can break us. When we stick together, they can't break us. I especially want to do a shout out to Abiline and the Gypsy Roma Traveller community, because they have been treated appallingly. And my family have come from Gypsy tradition as well. And thank you very, very much for the invite.
Thank you very, very much for that, Dave. And you read the stories of the things that those undercover coppers did, and you just think, how on earth do they think that they can justify that? The lies that they told, the distortions in terms of relationships, absolutely outrageous behaviour. And then an attempt to sort of, to uphold the law. I don't think so. And you're absolutely right. We don't want to give people like that any more powers. Our next speaker is someone who's been the target, represents people who've been the target of of this government in terms of the stand that they've taken against climate disaster, fighting for an end to the policies that bring about the climate change that we've got. And we know that Priti Patel and the government have absolutely targeted XR because they know that there is such widespread anger about what's happening with climate change, and there is no way that they're listening, and therefore people have absolutely no option but to engage in protest. So I have sort of great pleasure in asking Suzanne Jeffrey, who's from the Campaign for Climate Change, to come and talk about the way that they've been targeted and their opposition to this bill. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks for the invitation to speak tonight. Very much agree with Dave's comments. It's fantastic to be part of such a significant selection of activists from across the movement speaking in unity tonight against the police and crime bill. And also want to echo what Dave was just saying there when he spoke about what's at stake in terms of this bill, because there is a huge amount at stake in terms of this bill. Peaceful protest, courageous people engaged in peaceful protest has been part of our movement always. When you think about the role of the suffragettes, when you think about the millions of people engaged in peaceful protest against colonial powers, you think about the tactics that they're trying to outlaw. These are the tactics and the history and the legacy of Gandhi. That's essentially what's at stake in this bill. They're essentially saying that those tactics are no longer to be allowed to be used by the movement. And peaceful protest is incredibly important. It's important in terms of bringing change. It's important for these reasons as well. It's effective in shining a light on injustice. It cuts through the lack of information that we have about so many important issues in our life. It raises awareness, it mobilizes, it inspires, it allows us to speak up in unity, and it fundamentally allows us to bring about change. And it's been absolutely crucial in the environmental movement and in the climate movement. It's been an absolutely central tactic of peaceful, non-violent direct action, whether we go all the way back in terms of Greenpeace in the 1970s, highlighting the issue of nuclear testing. If we go to the climate camps of the early 2000s, starting to raise the issues and the understanding and the awareness of the urgency of the climate crisis. Crucially, our country would be littered with fracking wells, destruction of our environment and our local areas if it hadn't been for the peaceful anti-fracking movement that was able to stop fracking across the UK. And most crucially, XR, as Michael Mansfield mentioned earlier, those hugely important, significant peaceful protests combined with the climate strikes that put at the top of the political agenda, which is where it belongs, the urgency of the climate crisis. Now, they have said in their propaganda for this, in favour of this ridiculously rushing through this destructive piece of legislation, they have said it's about balancing the right to protest with disruption. There is no protest, on no matter what scale, that is anywhere near as disruptive as the business as usual that those protests are trying to challenge. And there is nothing more destructive than the business, nothing more disruptive than the business as usual of the climate crisis and the climate emergency. We have a responsibility to challenge this, to campaign and to speak out for the kind of change that we need. There is so much at stake in opposing this bill. There is so much at stake in terms of the movement that we need to build in this current moment. This is the year of COP26. To me, it is no surprise that they pushed this bill through in the year that they are hosting the COP26 talks on climate change, and they want to avoid the spotlight falling on their government and their failure to tackle the climate crisis. We need to stand united as we've done today. We need to oppose the bill, and we need to have the confidence to continue to mobilise with a peaceful, non-violent protest that we know brings about the change that we so urgently need. Thanks for inviting me tonight.
That's brilliant, Suzanne. Thank you very much indeed. And I couldn't say it better myself, that idea that sort of, you know, that there is more and more reason for us to protest, given the absolute disruption and destruction that this government is engaging in. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we've got COP26 and we've got this bill coming through at the same time. Our next speaker is someone who, again, will be very well known to you. Gareth Peirce has been a human rights solicitor for a long time and represented sort of people from the Guildford Forum, Mozambique, and many more. And it's a great pleasure for me to invite her and see her accept that invitation and speak to us tonight as part of the coalition to oppose this horrendous bill and the attacks on human rights that have been going on in this country and are escalating at an ever increasing pace. Thank you, Gareth.
Thank you. There are occasional moments when we can take stock. We're compelled to take stock collectively, an opportunity given to us to hold a mirror up to ourselves and consider who we are. And we've had those moments of shock in our lives very recently. We have had the assassination, the murder of George Floyd. We've had the power, the moral power of the Black Lives Matter movement. We have had the death of Sarah Everard and the reaction that women are in danger in our streets in this country. And we have ongoing an inquiry into the actions over decades of police in relation to political protest. The undercover police used not to respect the right of protest, but to target thousands of groups, holding governments to account, institutions to account, and targeting women activists, using and abusing intimate relationships for the state. In all of those circumstances, we ought to be renewing our respect for what protest does, what we can do individually and together. We have the opportunity to look back at the marches, Aldermaston, the women at Greenham Common, the New Cross Fire, the 20,000 Black people, young, who took to the streets, 13 dead and nothing said. We have that opportunity to be revisiting our relationship with the state and the police. But now at that very moment, this moment, we're instead having to confront the most extraordinary legislation in our lifetime, where a government minister, the Home Secretary, is being given the authority, taking the authority to make decisions about who protests and who doesn't. It's breathtaking, and I'm not even sure that most of the country is aware that it's happening. Now, of the protests in the past which earn our respect, one in particular has significance. The protest of Helen Steele, who together with Dave Morris took on the environmental brutality of the McDonald's chain, was sued for libel, and after decades in the European Court established for us all the right to freedom of expression. The European Court was Steele and Morris against the UK, and Steele and Morris won and established the right that there should be uncomfortable protest, that it should make society react, that in particular in terms of the environment, protest had to be protected. But instead, Helen is one of those individual women seeking redress and disclosure and explanation because she was targeted by an undercover police officer. She was a victim, and yet she's heroically established our right, all of us, the freedom of expression. But now peaceful protest is to go. It's not intended, whether it's campaigning for a local library to remain open or for a pedestrian crossing. All of that is now subject to the government, the police, saying we don't accept it, it's too noisy, it doesn't suit our political purposes. It's no good us thinking that someday, like Helen Steele, we will crawl towards the European Court of Human Rights and re-establish the right to protest. It doesn't work that way.
Begin to wind up, please, Gareth.
When legislation comes in, there's never a momentum to undo it. The reference to the 1980s when the police took new powers and the claim now to redo that and have more, it won't come back. This is it. This is intended for our lifetimes, a repressive series of measures that are fit for a dictatorship. And thank you for the opportunity to say we just can't expect someone else to protest. We have to take it on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gareth. And you're absolutely right. We do have to take it on. And I think that's what we want to try and coordinate and organise that with. And I think that the number of forces whose ability to protest and speak out is at risk. It's about uniting all those together in a big enough opposition to both oppose it, but also, you know, if necessary, to defy it and stand up to it. Our next speaker is Anna Vickerstaff. Anna's a campaigner with 350.org who've been involved with attempts to resist the bill. And we know that the current climate protests are going to be targeted, especially with the COP26 happening. So thank you very much, Anna, for agreeing to speak today.
Thanks so much for having me. So yeah, I'm here as an activist and a campaigner, but I'm also here as someone that was at the Sarah Everard vigil and saw firsthand how the police abuse their powers. And I think a question we need to ask ourselves is why in any situation, but especially why in that situation, did the police feel so comfortable with their own authority that they felt like they could abuse it in that way, in that specific frame? And I think it speaks that the police as an institution is systemically has a problem with gender-based violence in the way that it has a systemic problem with racism. And I'm really glad that this panel started by talking about the increase in racist powers that of stop and search that this bill is going to give to the police, and also the racist impact it's going to have on Gypsy and traveller communities. I think those are the things we need to be resisting hardest. I'm also someone that's experienced gender-based violence, and I've seen how the police don't take that seriously. Like, we know that only 1.4% of all sexual assault cases ever reach a sentencing phase. So for me, it's massively insulting to have people say that this bill is going to increase sentencing and protect women, when actually the bill says more about protecting statues than it does about protecting women. And in fact, the only notable mention of women in the bill is that there's going to be 500 new prison places for women, when actually we know that that puts those women in more vulnerable positions. 194 and counting women have died in police custody since the 1970s. So this bill does nothing to protect women. And as someone that's experienced police violence at protest and experienced police ignorance when I've requested their help around gender-based violence, I refuse to believe that this bill is protecting anyone but the state and corporate interests. I think we've spoken a lot about the right to protest and why it's important, but I think we should also be really aware that, like, this crackdown on protest isn't new, and this is part of a really scary trend that's been happening over like a series of years. I think some like particularly notable examples are the Stanza 15 case, where some activists grounded a chartered deportation flight, which got their case upgraded to a terrorism charge, which was unprecedented. And that got overturned in the Court of Appeal just recently, but that was a really terrifying crackdown on protest. Similarly, we've heard about the anti-fracking protests. 3 anti-fracking protesters got sent to prison on a public nuisance charge in 2018, which again was overturned by the Court of Appeal. Again, a completely unprecedented charge, but another example of the crackdown on protest. The anti-fracking movement also faced a series of unprecedented injunctions, which was a really scary thing. And most recently, we've seen really terrifying crackdown on the protests at the Napier barracks, both on the people that have been detained in those barracks, but also a journalist was arrested for reporting on activism there. So this is like a really growing trend of crackdown and protest. And this, as Grace said earlier, it's no coincidence they're trying to sneak this through now when the lockdown rules mean it's much more difficult for us to protest, that they're trying to limit what will be a big wave of resistance after lockdown is lifted. But in the way that the crackdown on protest isn't new, neither is resistance. And no matter what happens with this bill being passed, people are going to resist. What I would say is we have a specific window now, and we need to make the resistance as loud as possible so that we can try and stop this bill in its tracks. But as I said, nothing, no matter what happens with this bill going through, it won't stop people's resisting. And I want to give a massive shout out to Sisters Uncut, who have been leading the resistance against this bill, against gender-based violence, not just in the last few days, but for a really long time. And for those of you who aren't meetinged out, they're having an open meeting at 7 to talk about next steps of mobilisation. So maybe see some of you there. Thanks.
Brilliant, Anna, brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Our next speaker is Bianca Ali, who's from Black Lives Matter in Cardiff and Vale, and she's been part of the campaign to get justice for Mohammed Hassan, who died being in police custody in January. And I think there is no doubt that, as people have said, this bill will escalate in a way that it escalates all the attacks that we're seeing, that we're seeing on our right to express opinions that are different to ones of the government and the people who run society at the moment. I think that from the Black Lives Matter protest, it's crucial that we get somebody to talk about that. So thank you very much, Bianca, for agreeing to speak today.
Thank you, Karen. First of all, I'd just like to say we don't actually represent the campaign, but we have supported them heavily since the beginning of, the case. For those that don't know the story of Mahmoud, he was taken into police custody on the 8th of January, released on the 9th. He was taken in following a public disturbance at his address. He was released without charge on the 9th, released covered in blood and battered and bruised. He went home, he went to sleep, and he didn't wake up. Since then, South Wales Police released the statement straight away saying that they were in no way responsible for any misconduct or any force used on Mahmoud. But we have now found out the 5 police officers are under further investigation by the IOPC for misconduct and for false entries into custody records. So we are calling for the suspension of these 5 officers, and we are also calling for the immediate resignation of Chief Constable Jeremy Vaughan based on his first statement stating that they had nothing to do with this. In response to this case, we at BLM Cardiff and Vale stood strong with the community in solidarity, fighting for justice and transparency for 4 days strong in January the 11th, I think, until the 14th. At the time, we've seen complete hostility from the police, intimidating protesters with COVID fines, laughing and nodding when asked if they were responsible for the death of Mahmoud. They were just generally very hostile, trying to push people off the road. They fined myself and named me as an organiser, in which 2 riot vans turned up at my property to give me the summons. And now we see that they're running a campaign of revenge. We've had 3 arrests since the protests, 2 of which were young white people, 1 of which was a young Muslim man. And this is important to state because of the way that they were arrested. One young white lady has come forward and told us the story, and she said that she wasn't put into handcuffs. It was just, come with us, Mrs. Jones, in this way, blah, blah, blah. And the young Muslim man who was arrested, he had his door kicked off. He was face down on his bed in handcuffs while he was in his boxers. His house was searched without a warrant. And yeah, that was his experience with South Wales Police for the exact same arrests. We've had 2 voluntary interview requests by the police, followed by threats to arrest under obstruction of a police officer if they did not attend the voluntary interviews. We've had a mother contacted by social services after a 14-year-old daughter was fined. All of these offences, may I add, they're not COVID related, they're all public offences. Although it's not although it's not just been in the street, we've mounted a strong campaign and put the pressure on them from BLM and the community. They have been intimidated. We have been strong. We have not moved when they tried to push us off the road, etc. The community is strong and the police know that. And this is why they have the protest bill. If they weren't afraid, then why the bill? This bill is an attack on us all. It can criminalise protesters for organising demonstrations, can impose time limits on them. It's a horrible piece of legislation that must be stopped at all costs.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bianca. You're absolutely right. I mean, you follow it and it's absolutely horrendous what they're doing. Really, really awful. And thank you for everybody down in Cardiff for continuing to fight against that awful racism and repression of people who are expressing disgust at what happened. So thank you. Our next speaker is Wayman Bennett. He's the co-coordinator of Stand Up to Racism. He's been a long-term campaigner against racism and police violence. And I think there is no doubt that the bill and the general direction that this government is taking the country in is for an increase and ramping up of racism as a way of trying to divide us and blame each other and scapegoat each other rather than look at the people who are the cause of the problem. So thank you very much, Wayman, for agreeing to speak tonight.
Thank you very much, and I'm really glad to be here and say what a serious situation we are in. The bill is 307 pages long of filth, of absolute filth. There's nothing we can keep in that bill. That bill is an organised set to attack the rights that we've got today. Frederick Douglass says that power concedes nothing without a demand, and our demand is that we want to get rid of that bill. And I've been, to tell you the truth, I've been arrested 38 times, not because I'm a criminal. I've been arrested on protest every time I've come out. This bill means that there wouldn't be really organised opposition against racists and fascists. Imagine no Cable Street. Imagine no Lewisham. Imagine no demonstration when the BNP won the seat with Griffin. Imagine no demonstration against the EDL. Imagine them being able to go on the street and that they would do anything about it. I tell you one of the reasons why I was arrested. At the beginning, I was arrested because I said Tommy Robinson was a racist and a fascist. And you know what the police told me? They said he was part of a human rights organisation. That's what they told me, and then locked me up. They locked me up and said they threatened me with a conspiracy. Fortunately, as a policeman arrested in Manchester, they couldn't find a law that could keep you in prison for 10 years. I remember the chief saying, isn't there a law against what he's doing? And they were saying, no, we couldn't find it. That's what we pay our taxpayers' money for. And by the way, when you become a police officer, it says you're there to protect the Queen's peace. And I tell you something about the Queen's peace. She's got an awful lot of pieces, right? She's rich and she's powerful. And the law isn't for us. If you want to question about what the law's for, look at Michael Gove. He sniffed half of Peru up his nose, yeah? And you know what he said? He said, sorry. Why isn't the police bill about catching those kind of people that do that? There's not a police bill about that. I'm not worried about if people take drugs, but I am worried about the disproportionality. And if you're black, this is the best beauty. The McPherson inquiry said that the police were institutionally racist. And when you read the bill, it says a question about police discretion. So are we talking about giving a police officer who actually would discriminate against you more powers than they've ever had? And we're not talking, I think there's a problem with the government. They say that they want to go back to the good old days. They want to go back to the 1860s. They don't want to go back centuries where we didn't actually have those rights that we fought for. And I think that's the reason why we have to understand what we've got to do. And by the way, I think even if they bring in this bill, we're talking about organised resistance. I was part of something called the Criminal Justice Bill. And I remember when they brought that in, they took away the right to silence and we never got it back. We never actually got it back. If they take away the right to protest, they won't get it back. But I tell you what we did do, we made part of that bill unusable. I remember them saying that they were worried about people listening to different beats of music. And I remember a police officer telling me that the idea of black and white people dancing in a field together made their blood run cold. That's what I was told. This is a dangerous movement. I think they've gone back to those days. And don't forget something called Clause 28, when they brought in a law that said it was illegal to say that to be proud to be LGBTQ in this country, and it was done by the Tories. We beat that law, by the way. It was repealed and destroyed. And so what I want to say is that for all the women that have been attacked, for all the things that have taken place, we have to understand that we can beat the law providing we do one thing. I tell you what's interesting about this demonstration. whether you're a peace demonstrator, wherever you are, it's an attack on all of us. By the way, the government said it needs nuclear weapons in order to stop draconian governments from controlling us. They want to be able to nuke China and Russia because they don't believe in our rights, yeah? I think I'm against nuclear weapons, but I'll be honest with you, if we want our rights, we're going to have to fight for them. No justice, no peace, solidarity with all the people fighting. I've stopped.
Thank you very much, Raymond, and I do think you're right. I think we do have to oppose the whole bill. I don't not just limit ourselves to remove the worst elements of it, but I do think we have to look at opposing the whole bill because it goes through. I think that it's inevitable. It is going to make it harder for all of us, and we need to then think about how we're going to take a stand. As the most effective way of doing that, I think, is to continue to protest and to defy it, come what may. And I think that you look at the way that the impact that's had on those of us who've done that just in the last few weeks, and I think you're absolutely right. Our next speaker actually is about Stop the War. It's from Stop the War. It's Lindsay German, one of the co-founders of Stop the War, and I think it's interesting that whilst they're trying to increase the powers of the state internally in terms of what they can do within the UK to people who resist, it's also that they want to increase the powers of their weaponry around the world in order to impose their will on people. And I think that we have the right to resist both, and a very warm welcome to Lindsay, who's, as I say, one of the co-founders of Stop the War.
Thanks very much, Karen, and thanks for organising the meeting and thanks for inviting me. I think it's, as all the speakers have said, it's of crucial importance that we have a campaign and that we do organise around this bill. If you look at the bill, and there are so many different elements of it, but if you look at it, it strikes me that it's very deliberately aimed at protests that have happened in recent years that they don't like, whether it's Extinction Rebellion, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's people protesting on their own outside Parliament, which of course we had for years with Brian Hoare, and more recently there's been all the various Brexit protests and so on. It's very deliberately targeted in this kind of way. And I think we have to understand it in terms of it doesn't want to let people have effective protests at all. It says it wants to limit protests if they cause disruption or if they have an impact on Parliament or on big companies or whatever. Now, what's the point of a demonstration if it doesn't have impact and if it doesn't disrupt things? That's why you have a demonstration. They're not, there's no point in having a demonstration which is silent and where people sit in a corner and don't do anything. So what they're really saying is don't demonstrate. And if you do demonstrate, the kind of things that you've already experienced, Karen, in terms of the fine, the £10,000 fine, okay, it got paid very, very quickly because there was crowdfunding, because there was solidarity over it. But this is what they want to do, stop people from being able to do this. And why do they want to do this? They want to stop these protests because they know that there is growing anger and discontent in this country. And we've seen it over the Sarah Everard thing to do with the protests over a woman who was murdered. Allegedly, the person who is in custody for that is actually a serving member of was a serving member of the Metropolitan Police. So they know there's anger over that. They know there's anger over racism. There is growing industrial struggle. There are growing number of picket lines. All these things are going on. And they know that when the lockdown ends, there will be a wave of these things going on. And this is what they want to try to stop. And interestingly, these restrictions on protests weren't in the first lockdown regulations. They have been in the most recent lockdown regulations. And you've got to see that as a very, very conscious decision by the government and by the police. Now, I went down and protested in Parliament Square. I went on Saturday to my local vigil. I didn't go to Clapham, but I went down to Parliament Square on Monday and I spoke at the protest there because I was so angry and enraged, not just at the murder of Sarah Everard, but the way in which the police behaved on Saturday. I find it quite hard to believe. And I really find it strange now that we're hearing from Cressida Dick and Priti Patel that this was really terrible and went too far. These decisions aren't made just by one local policeman behaving badly. They are made at very, very high levels, and we all know that. And I think we need to be aware of what is going on. And it seems to me one of the messages we have to come out with tonight is that the best way to defend the right to protest is to keep protesting. And speaking for myself, speaking for the Stop the War Coalition, speaking on behalf, I'm sure, of most of us here, I think this is absolutely what we have to continue to do. And therefore, we have to stay on the streets, we have to be organised, and we have to also remember one very, very important thing. They have never given us these rights to protest. They pretend that Britain is this kind of perfect democracy, which has allowed people to protest for generations. That is simply not true. For hundreds of years, Tolpuddle martyrs, it's the anniversary of them today. Look at it from then to now. There have repeatedly been protests, and we have to make sure we stand in that tradition and we fight back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you. That was brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. And that is exactly what we intend to do, is to continue to protest until we put a stop to this sort of repression. Our final speaker now is Apsana Begum, who's the MP for Poplar and Limehouse. People will be pleased to know we've had well over 1,000 people view it directly, and over 750 have shared the live video on Facebook. So that's a massive audience. So I'm going to ask Apsana, who's been really outspoken in the House of Commons and at the protests in Parliament Square, and I think is one of those inspiring new young women MPs, often black, who are sort of just really showing what it's possible to do as an MP compared to the lame opposition that I think Michael Mansfield referred to earlier. So thank you very much, Apsana, for agreeing to speak tonight and be our final speaker.
Thanks so much, Karen, and thanks so much for that warm welcome. The events of the last week and indeed in the last year have shown that we are at a time of crisis politically, and we can't underestimate the scale of the task in front of us, locally, regionally, or nationally. And the attacks in the last week should be a stark warning for all of us, especially those of us who haven't yet maybe fully realised that the establishment hostility presents big challenges for all of us. There's no doubt about it that we have powerful enemies in the media, in big business, and the right wing. And we've seen that in the way in which the government is effectively passing these bills, pieces of legislation, without enough scrutiny, but also enough opposition. The Spycops bill being one of those, which further sanctioned state male violence by granting greater powers to undercover police and granting them greater impunity from activities such as being in relationships with women and being violent, all in the name of national security. We saw that in the way in which the government granted greater impunity for war crimes abroad for our military personnel through the Overseas Operations Bill last year. And just today, the government released sneakily snippets to the media about upcoming measures on dangerous crossings, which would coincide with asylum seekers potentially being sent to processing centres under new plans with the immigration system. And we see that in the way in which the government passed the Counter-Terrorism and Security Bill last June, emboldening the PREVENT programme and delaying its so-called independent review. A new investigation today alone just found that the government's own commission for countering extremism has itself got ties, perhaps ironically, to alt-right activists and sympathisers of the white genocide conspiracy. That's all of this in just the last year alone. And now we see a greater descent into authoritarianism with the policing bill, which the government this week brailed through Parliament through its second reading. Some of us resisted that with a reasoned amendment because, like Reissmann said earlier, there is nothing in this bill that could even be amended really to make it okay to pass in any form. So the reasoned amendment itself would have thrown it out, scrapped it, and asked the government to come back with something else. That reasoned amendment fully encompassed, despite having cross-party support and over 40 MPs, the rights to protect particular communities under attack by this bill. Women, ethnic minority communities, trade unionists, anti-racist and climate emergency campaigners, and disgracefully contained specific provisions targeting Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities and specifically targeting them. Unfortunately, as I say, it wasn't selected, and the amendments passed were, in my view, unable to counterbalance the legislation's unprecedented breach of essential principles of freedom to protest and freedom of assembly. Now that bill has passed second reading, and like many of you, I recognise immediately, even after the vote, the extremely disturbing events where legal observers themselves were arrested at the vigil on Tuesday evening. But I recognise that these bodies, these interests, the government, and their actions and behaviours should make us come together under a collective banner, struggling for a society that works in our interests, because that mainstream political elite will never have the answers to the challenges we face. So whilst we continue to ask questions about the powers that our police forces have, the way they're executed, how they target people, how they're scrutinised, and how the police are held to account, in Parliament, I'll keep doing that with colleagues to oppose the bill every step of the way. But remember one thing, and I will finish on this one note: draconian legislation is intended to limit our right to protest, our rights to collectively organise and gather, and it's intended to imprison us, fragment us, break us apart. And it's because this is the way that we can be suppressed, that ultimately it must be met with mass movement. I'm with you in building that mass movement, in opposing the government on draconian and authoritarian measures at every step of the way. Solidarity.
Thank you very much, Apsana, and thank you to every single one of the speakers tonight who've been absolutely brilliant, and I think create an overall sort of, group of people who are saying that for lots and lots of reasons, lots and lots and lots of us will completely oppose this bill, and we'll do what we can to mobilise and organise against it. And we hope following tonight's meeting that groups who are opposed to that can maybe get together and look at where to go next, because there is no doubt we have to do the work in Parliament in relating to the actual bill. But you're also right, Apsana, and lots of other people who've spoken tonight, that unless we actually defy that restrictions on our right to protest, unless we are not intimidated and we carry on going out there, then I think we will not be able to resist, and we will end up with a world that gets worse and worse with our inability to affect it. And I think it is shocking what they're doing, really shocking. I listened tonight and there are some things that I just think I didn't realise that was in it, I didn't realise that was in it, and it just feels like this is a complete sort of step up to another level that the British state are trying to do, and we have to absolutely resist it. And I think we'll try and organise further. I'm hoping that this was sort of a first step, and I know there are lots of other groups who've done fantastic stuff just in the last week. The fact that we've had the protest, the fact that Netpol and Sisters Uncut and a whole number of people have come out and organised and been part of those protests has made it harder for them to do what they want to do, and we have to continue to make every step of what they take away from us really hard to do, and fight for our human rights to protest and to have an influence over what happens in our life. So thank you very much for attending. We've had a massive attendance tonight, and hopefully more people will watch it as it's been recorded, and it will be out there for people to look at. So please stay involved, stay active, and we'll look at what we can do both within our workplaces, on the streets, and wherever we can in order to oppose what this government want to do to us. So thank you to all the fantastic speakers and all the people who've come and watched. Cheers.